Imagine a world where every day, freedom feels like a distant dream, yet some refuse to accept anything less. Across the Americas, from the dense jungles of Brazil to the hidden swamps of North Carolina, enslaved Africans dared to escape the brutal confines of plantations. They risked everything: harsh terrain, predators, and relentless hunters to carve out lives where they could breathe, think, and live on their own terms. These brave individuals became the founders of Maroon communities, secret societies built in the shadows of colonial power, where freedom was not just imagined but fiercely protected. In these remote corners of mountains, forests, and wetlands, Maroons transformed the wilderness into a sanctuary. They cultivated crops, fished rivers teeming with life, hunted game, and traded with nearby indigenous peoples. Every hut, every garden, every path through the swamp represented resilience, ingenuity, and an unwavering will to survive. For them, survival was not simply about staying alive, it was about living with dignity and reclaiming humanity in a world designed to strip it away. What makes these stories remarkable is not just the act of running away. It is the creation of entirely new societies. Maroon communities had leaders, councils, and systems of justice. They celebrated rituals and upheld traditions that connected them to their African heritage, blending ancestral knowledge with the realities of a new land. Imagine entire communities thriving where the rest of the world only saw danger and desolation, places where formerly enslaved people could raise children without the fear of being sold, where they could worship freely, and where they could defend their autonomy with courage and strategy. These hidden societies were not only a refuge, they were a form of resistance. Every day lived outside the plantations challenged the very foundation of slavery. Colonial powers launched expeditions, sent soldiers, and tried to destroy these communities. Yet Maroons often outwitted them, using the terrain, knowledge of the land, and solidarity among their people. In Jamaica, Suriname, Brazil, and across the Caribbean, these acts of defiance left an indelible mark on history, showing the world that oppression could be confronted with intelligence, courage, and unbreakable community bonds. Today, we honor the stories of these remarkable men and women. Their courage, creativity, and determination remind us that freedom is worth fighting for, and that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit seeks light. As we explore these hidden histories, we uncover lessons that inspire us to value resilience, community, and the enduring pursuit of liberty. If this story moves you, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel to journey with us into more untold chapters of history. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Let us keep the legacy of courage alive together. Deep within landscapes that outsiders considered untamed and unforgiving, the Maroon communities learned to shape the land into a living testament of their freedom. Their escape from the plantations was not merely an act of flight. It was the first step in building an entirely new way of life, a life that demanded imagination, resourcefulness, and a strength of spirit that refused to be crushed. In the thick swamps of the Carolinas, the rugged mountains of Jamaica, the endless rainforests of Brazil and Suriname, and the hidden valleys of the Caribbean islands, these men and women discovered that the very wilderness feared by colonists could become a fortress and a home. With each passing season, they transformed these so-called wild spaces into thriving societies where the bonds of family, culture, and self-rule grew stronger than any chain that had once held them. They began by listening to the land. Rivers, once symbols of peril, became lifelines for fishing and transport. Forests that had seemed impenetrable offered fruits, medicinal plants, and game for hunting. From small clearings they carved gardens and fields, planting crops of cassava, yams, maize, and plantains, each seed a silent declaration of independence. These gardens were more than food sources. They were symbols of permanence, proof that they had come not merely to hide but to endure. The knowledge carried across the Atlantic from their African homelands guided their hands as they worked the soil. Techniques for rotating crops and managing the forest floor ensured that their farms thrived year after year. Nature, once the enemy that slave catchers had warned would devour them, became a trusted alien partner. Trade became the lifeblood of their growing settlements. With skill and caution, Maroons forged relationships with neighboring indigenous peoples and even with sympathetic outsiders. They bartered fish, smoked meat, and woven goods for iron tools, salt, and fabrics. These exchanges required more than clever bargaining. They required careful diplomacy. Every encounter beyond their hidden borders carried risk, yet each successful trade strengthened their independence. Through these subtle networks they gained access to materials the wilderness could not provide, and, in turn, created a quiet economic power that the colonial world could neither control nor fully understand. As their communities expanded, so too did their sense of collective identity. These were not scattered bands of fugitives but societies that deliberately shaped their own governance and culture. Councils of elders or elected leaders established rules to settle disputes and keep peace among families. Decisions were debated beneath the canopy of ancient trees or by the flickering light of communal fires, where the voices of women and men carried equal weight. Justice was measured not by colonial laws but by a code born of shared struggle and mutual respect. Every law and custom reinforced the belief that their freedom was not a temporary refuge but a permanent reality. Culture, too, became both shield and beacon. The rhythms of African drums echoed through the night, blending with the sounds of the forest and reminding every heart of a homeland far across the ocean. Songs passed down through generations carried stories of ancestors and heroes, of courage and survival. Religious ceremonies drew from African traditions and adapted to the new lands, creating a spiritual language that spoke of both memory and hope. In these celebrations, children learned not only the history of their people, but also the values that bound the community together: resilience, solidarity, and an unshakable commitment to self-determination. Despite the constant threat of colonial patrols and armed expeditions, the Maroons proved impossible to subdue. Their knowledge of the land gave them an advantage no army could match. They built hidden paths through dense vegetation, camouflaged their homes, and devised signals to warn of approaching danger. When forced to fight, they used the terrain itself as a weapon, striking swiftly and disappearing before the enemy could respond. But for all their skill in defense, it was their society, not their weapons, that defined their victory. Every harvest brought another season of survival. Every child born in freedom another affirmation that the Maroon experiment was not merely a temporary escape, but a triumph of human will. These communities stood as living proof that even in a world built on the cruelty of bondage, freedom could be claimed and protected. Their farms, their trade networks, their councils, and their sacred gatherings formed the fabric of autonomous societies that owed nothing to the powers that sought to enslave them. By cultivating the land and shaping their own destiny, the Maroons turned wilderness into home and resistance into a way of life, leaving a legacy that still whispers through the forests, mountains, and rivers where their courage once took root. Within these hidden strongholds of freedom, culture became as essential to survival as food and shelter. For the Maroons understood that true liberty was not only the absence of chains, but also the preservation of the spirit that had traveled with them across the ocean. In the hush of the forests and the echoing hills, they wove together the memories of distant homelands with the realities of their new surroundings, creating a living bridge between past and present that gave their children more than just a place to live. It gave them a sense of who they were. The languages spoken in these settlements carried the tones and rhythms of many African regions, blending and evolving into unique dialects that only the Maroons themselves could fully understand. Around evening fires, elders taught these words to the young, each phrase a link to ancestors who had once walked the coasts of West Africa. Each story an unbroken thread tying the living to those who had endured the Middle Passage. Their spiritual life flourished with a quiet strength, for religion was both compt and compass. The Maroons brought with them beliefs that honored the spirits of nature, ancestors, and a world beyond the one they could see. These practices did not remain unchanged. They adapted to the rivers, mountains, and skies of the Americas, embracing new symbols and blending with the influences of neighboring indigenous peoples and, at times, even elements of European faiths. Ceremonies might take place beneath towering trees where moonlight filtered through the leaves like a blessing, or beside the rushing waters of a hidden stream whose voice mingled with the chant of prayers. Drums set the rhythm of these gatherings, their deep resonance echoing across valleys, carrying both memory and hope. Every beat was a heartbeat of a people who refused to forget who they were. Social customs became the architecture of their independence. Kinship ties were carefully nurtured, extending beyond bloodlines to create networks of mutual responsibility. Weddings were occasions of music and dance, where the community gathered not merely to celebrate love, but to reaffirm their unity and strength. Births were welcomed with rituals that invoked the protection of ancestors, ensuring that each child entered the world with the blessings of those who had come before. Even the telling of history became a ceremony in itself. Storytellers, both men and women, passed down tales of African heroes and legends, tales of the dangerous journey to freedom, and stories of their own battles and triumphs. These narratives were more than entertainment. They were the lifeblood of a shared identity, a reminder that the Maroons were not just survivors but creators of a vibrant new world. As the seasons turned, their culture did not simply persist, it blossomed. Songs that had once been sung under African skies now carried the scent of American forests and Caribbean seas. The Maroons used the plants and materials of their new environment to craft instruments, garments, and ceremonial objects, marrying old techniques with new resources. The result was a culture that honored its roots while reflecting the landscapes of its rebirth. Children grew up fluent in this dual inheritance, learning to fish and farm as their parents had taught them, while also absorbing the myths, songs, and proverbs that had crossed the ocean hidden in their elders' hearts. This fusion of memory and adaptation gave the Maroon communities an unshakable identity. It allowed them to resist not only the physical forces of colonial armies but the subtler, more corrosive force of cultural erasure. By speaking their own words, singing their own songs, and practicing their own faiths, they asserted a truth the outside world could neither conquer nor deny. They were a people defined not by the suffering they had endured, but by the traditions they had chosen to keep alive. Their ceremonies and gatherings were not acts of nostalgia. They were declarations of permanence, proof that the freedom they fought for was not merely a matter of escaping chains, but of sustaining the soul of a people across time and place. Even as they traded with outsiders and occasionally forged uneasy truces with colonial powers, the Maroons remained vigilant in guarding the heart of their culture. They knew that the greatest victory lay not just in holding territory, but in ensuring that their children and grandchildren would inherit more than land, they would inherit a living heritage. And so the voices of their ancestors continued to echo in the cadence of their speech, in the swirl of their dances, and in the hush that fell when the storyteller began to speak. It is in these echoes that their true triumph endures. For the Maroon communities proved that freedom is more than survival. It is the unbroken song of a people who refuse to forget. Among the countless fires that flickered in the hidden valleys and forested mountains of the Maroon world, few shone as brightly as the courage of the leaders who rose to defend the freedom their people had claimed. As the Maroon communities grew stronger, the colonial powers realized that these settlements were not temporary hideouts, but thriving societies that threatened the very foundation of their rule. Determined to crush this challenge, the British dispatched soldiers and scouts into the dense interior of Jamaica, believing that force and intimidation would be enough to bring the Maroons back under control. But the people who had turned wilderness into home were not easily subdued. They knew every trail and ridge, every rushing stream and secret cave, and they were led by figures whose names would echo through history, leaders like Nanny of the Maroons and Kojo, whose wisdom and daring transformed defiance into legend. Nanny was more than a warrior. She was the heartbeat of her people, a strategist whose understanding of the land was matched only by her unbreakable spirit. Oral traditions describe her as possessing both keen intellect and a presence that inspired unity. She trained her fighters to move like shadows through the Blue Mountains, to strike swiftly and disappear before the British could respond. Her knowledge of herbs and the rhythms of nature allowed her to care for her warriors' wounds and keep her people nourished, even when the enemy cut off supplies. But Nanny's genius was not confined to the art of war. She knew that freedom demanded more than victory in battle. It required a vision of a society that could endure. Under her guidance, the Maroons of the Windward communities strengthened their culture, preserved their rituals, and maintained the spiritual and social traditions that gave them identity and purpose. For her followers, she was not only a commander, but a guardian of the heritage that bound them together. On the western side of the island, Kojo, also known as Kudjo, emerged as a leader equally fierce and shrewd. He too understood that the fight for autonomy was a battle of endurance as much as arms. Kojo organized his people with discipline, turning their knowledge of the cockpit country, maze-like limestone hills, into a weapon more effective than any musket. British troops, unaccustomed to the twisting ravines and hidden caves, found themselves ambushed and outmaneuvered time and again. Kojo's fighters struck with precision and melted back into the landscape, leaving their opponents frustrated and exhausted. Yet Kojo's strength lay not only in his ability to fight but in his capacity to negotiate. He recognized that lasting freedom required more than endless skirmishes. It required a settlement that even the colonial government could not deny. The British, wary of a conflict they could neither win nor contain, eventually sought terms. Through long intense negotiations, Kojo and other Maroon leaders secured a treaty in 1739 that granted the Leeward Maroons their autonomy and recognized their right to the lands they occupied. Nanny's Windward Maroons achieved a similar treaty soon after. These agreements were extraordinary for their time. The British, one of the most powerful colonial empires, were forced to acknowledge the independence of communities formed by people they had once enslaved. The Maroons pledged to maintain peace and, in some cases, to help return future runaway slaves, a compromise that reflected the harsh realities of survival. But the heart of the treaties was undeniable: they had won the right to govern themselves. These victories were more than political milestones. They were acts of profound defiance. Nanny and Kojo had proven that people once held in bondage could not only escape but also outthink and outfight an empire. Their success sent a powerful message to enslaved Africans across the Caribbean and beyond. Freedom was possible, and communities of resistance could endure. Their leadership became legend, passed down in songs and stories that celebrated not just the battles they fought but the dignity they preserved. Even today, the spirit of Nanny and Kojo lingers in the hills of Jamaica, where their descendants honor their memory with ceremonies and festivals, and where their names are spoken as symbols of courage and the unyielding will to live free. The tale of these leaders is inseparable from the larger story of the Maroon world. Their strategies grew from the land they loved and the culture they protected, from the farms and villages that had blossomed in the wilderness, and from the songs and languages that carried the voices of Africa across an ocean. They fought not only to defend territory, but to safeguard the heritage that made their people more than survivors. They were nation builders. In the face of overwhelming odds, Nanny and Kojo transformed resistance into a lasting legacy, proving that the power of determination and unity could bend even the Maivan Empire. Their triumph remains a reminder that freedom is never simply granted. It is seized, defended, and nurtured by those with the vision and courage to claim it. Far to the south, where the dense rainforests of Brazil stretched across endless horizons and rivers wound like silver serpents through the land, another remarkable chapter in the saga of freedom was unfolding. There, in the rugged hills of what is now the state of Alagoas, escaped Africans created not just a single refuge but an entire network of settlements known as the Quilombo dos Palmares. Over time it grew into a vast confederation of villages, a living proof that people who had once been enslaved could build a society of their own, one that rivaled the colonial towns in strength and spirit. In the heart of this extraordinary realm rose a leader whose name would resonate for centuries: Zumbi. The warrior and statesman whose courage and vision transformed Palmares from a hidden sanctuary into a symbol of African resilience and the unbreakable human longing for liberty. The roots of Palmares reached back to the early 17th century, when groups of men and women, torn from their African homelands and forced to labor on Portuguese plantations, slipped away under cover of night. They followed the rivers deep into the forests, where the land rose in steep, wooded hills and natural fortresses of stone. There they built villages called mocambos, each one a small community bound by the shared memory of Africa and the shared determination never to be enslaved again. At first these villages were scattered, each tending its own gardens of cassava and maize, hunting in the forests and fishing in the streams. But as their numbers grew and the need for unity became clear, the mocambos began to join together, forming the great Confederation of Palmares, a society so strong and organized that it endured for nearly a century despite constant attacks from colonial forces. Into this world of defiance and self-rule was born Zumbi, a child, according to tradition, was captured as a boy and baptized by Portuguese missionaries, only to return to Palmares as a young man with the fire of freedom burning in his heart. His early years gave him a unique understanding of both the colonial world and the Maroon life. He knew the language and tactics of the Portuguese, but was also deeply rooted in the traditions of his African ancestors. When he rose to leadership, he brought with him the qualities of both warrior and diplomat, uniting the diverse villages under a common purpose and preparing them to resist the relentless campaigns that sought to destroy them. Under Zumbi's guidance, Palmares became more than a refuge. It was a functioning state. The villages were connected by paths through the forest, their defenses reinforced by palisades and watchtowers. Farmers cultivated rich crops while blacksmiths forged tools and weapons. Traders carried goods to and from the edges of Portuguese settlements, exchanging forest products for salt, iron, and cloth. Laws and customs were shaped by African heritage and the realities of their new home, creating a society that valued both freedom and order. Spiritual life flourished too, with ceremonies and music that kept alive the rhythms and beliefs of the many African peoples who had found common ground in Palmares. It was a place where children were born free, where families could live without the fear of being sold, and where the memory of bondage became a distant shadow. The Portuguese viewed Palmares as an intolerable challenge to their authority and wealth. Time and again they sent soldiers and mercenaries to burn the mocambos and drive the people back into slavery. Yet time and again they were met with fierce resistance. Zumbi's warriors knew every trail and ridge of their homeland. They set ambushes in the forest, struck swiftly, and vanished like mist. Their courage frustrated every expedition, and their endurance became legendary. For decades, the Portuguese failed to break the will of Palmares, and stories of this free black nation spread across Brazil and beyond, inspiring both fear in colonial rulers and hope among the enslaved. But the struggle was relentless, and the cost of freedom was high. In 1694 the Portuguese mounted their largest assault, bringing artillery and thousands of troops to bear against the heart of Palmares. The final battles were brutal, and eventually the great fortress of Macaco fell. Zumbi continued the fight, refusing to surrender, until he was betrayed and killed the following year. Yet even in death he became more than a leader, he became a symbol. His name became a rallying cry for those who believed that liberty was worth any sacrifice. And his spirit lived on in the songs and stories of his people. Today, Zumbi is honored as a national hero in Brazil, and the memory of Palmares stands as one of the most powerful examples of resistance in the history of the Americas. The Quilombo did not merely survive for nearly a century, it proved that men and women once enslaved could build a complex, enduring society, rooted in African culture and adapted to the New World. It showed that freedom was not only an ideal but a living, breathing reality, fought for and maintained by those who refused to yield. The legacy of Zumbi and the people of Palmares continues to inspire movements for justice and equality, reminding the world that the human desire for freedom is as boundless and resilient as the forests that once sheltered their dream. Deep within the dense green heart of Suriname's rainforests, where rivers carve endless silver ribbons through the trees and the air carries the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, communities like the Saramacca and Nduka built lives of remarkable autonomy and endurance. These men and women, descended from those who had once been enslaved, defied the power of the Dutch colonial world by creating societies that not only survived but flourished on their own terms. Their story is one of perseverance and quiet triumph, connecting seamlessly to the wider tale of Maroon resistance across the Americas, where freedom was not a gift but a hard-won inheritance. From the Caribbean mountains to the wetlands of Brazil and the forests of Suriname, each Maroon community shared a single heartbeat of defiance. And the Saramacca and Nduka were no exception. They did not merely escape captivity. They transformed their freedom into something lasting, forging their own laws, sustaining their own traditions, and negotiating their own place in a hostile colonial landscape. Their beginnings were born of desperation and courage. Enslaved people fled the plantations, slipping away into the thick jungles where Dutch patrols dared not linger for long. What began as small bands of fugitives slowly grew into villages that pulsed with life. Over time, these settlements developed intricate systems of governance and justice, rooted both in African heritage and in the realities of their new environment. Elders served as mediators of disputes, councils determined community decisions, and spiritual leaders safeguarded rituals that honored the ancestors and the spirits of the forest. They built homes from palm and timber, planted cassava and bananas in the clearings, and fished the broad rivers that wound like living highways through their territory. In their songs, dances, and ceremonies, echoes of African languages mingled with the new rhythms of the Americas, creating a culture that was neither wholly old nor entirely new, but something resilient and unique. The Dutch colonists, accustomed to absolute control, could not ignore these independent societies that thrived just beyond the plantations. Repeated attempts to capture or destroy the Saramacca and Nduka only proved the futility of force. Skilled in the ways of the forest, the Maroons knew how to move invisibly, using the dense canopy as both shield and ally. They staged strategic raids on plantations to rescue others and to gather supplies, vanishing like mist before the colonial soldiers could catch them. Over the years, the cost of conflict weighed heavily on the Dutch, and the Saramacca and Nduka understood the power of negotiation as clearly as they did the art of resistance. In the 18th century, after decades of warfare and failed campaigns, the Dutch authorities finally sought peace. They signed treaties that formally recognized the Saramacca and Nduka as free and self-governing peoples, an extraordinary acknowledgement of autonomy in an age when the institution of slavery still dominated the Atlantic world. These treaties were not mere symbols. They granted the Saramacca and Nduka the right to govern their own lands, to maintain their cultural practices, and to live without colonial interference. The very existence of such agreements stands as a testament to their courage and political acumen. Unlike many other Maroon groups whose freedom was always under threat, the Saramacca and Nduka secured a future in which their descendants could continue to live as they chose. Even today, centuries later, their communities endure, They still inhabit the forests their ancestors claimed, preserving languages that carry the cadence of Africa and practicing rituals that link them to both the past and the living landscape. Their music and art, their spiritual ceremonies and oral histories remain vibrant, reminding the world that their victory was not only military or political but cultural and spiritual as well. Their story completes the arc of resistance that began when enslaved Africans across the Americas chose to risk everything for liberty. From the rugged mountains of Jamaica, where Nanny of the Maroons led guerrilla campaigns, to the fortified quilombos of Brazil under the leadership of Zumbi, and finally to the deep Surinamese interior, where the Saramaka and Nduka carved out their independence. The narrative of Maroon resilience is one of shared determination and unbreakable will. Each community faced different landscapes, different colonial powers, and different challenges. Yet all proved that freedom could be seized and defended. The Saramaka and Nduka stand today as living proof of that truth. Their survival an unbroken thread that ties the struggles of the past to the identity of the present. Their enduring societies invite us to remember that the fight for dignity and self-determination has never been confined to one time or place, and that the echoes of their courage still resonate through the forests and rivers where their ancestors once walked. On the northern coast of South America, where the Caribbean Sea meets the lush Colombian lowlands, a remarkable settlement rose to embody the enduring spirit of resistance and cultural survival. San Basilio de Palenque, known simply as Palenque, became more than a refuge for those who had escaped enslavement. It became a living bridge between the African homelands left behind and the new world in which its people claimed their freedom. This community, along with the Black Caribs who flourished across the islands and coastal regions of the Caribbean, carried forward the same current of defiance and ingenuity that pulsed through the Maroon societies of Jamaica, Brazil, and Suriname. Their story fits seamlessly into the larger tapestry of African resilience in the Americas, proving once more that freedom was not only seized but carefully nurtured into a lasting heritage. Palenque began as a sanctuary carved from thick tropical forests and guarded by the swamps and hills that made pursuit by colonial forces treacherous. Those who fled the brutal plantations of Cartagena risked everything, navigating perilous terrain and evading armed patrols to reach the hidden settlement. But what they built once they arrived was far more than a hiding place. They fashioned a town with streets and homes, planted crops to feed their families, and raised children who would never know the whip of a slave driver. Over time, Palenque developed its own governance and laws, led by men and women who balanced the wisdom of African ancestors with the realities of their new environment. The Palencros created a social order rooted in equality and mutual care, one that allowed their culture to flourish even as the Spanish Empire grew all around them. Language became one of their most powerful tools of identity. The residents of Palenque developed a unique Creole language, Palenquero, blending Bantu grammar and vocabulary with Spanish words to form a living linguistic testament to their origins. Spoken and sung in the streets, Palenquero served as a daily reminder of the African rhythms that continued to beat in their hearts. The people preserved musical traditions as well, with drums and call and response songs carrying echoes of distant homelands. Festivals filled with dance and ritual gave life to the spirits of their ancestors, turning each celebration into both an act of remembrance and a declaration of survival. Even when Spanish authorities attempted to suppress African customs, the Palencros held fast, proving that freedom meant more than physical escape. It meant safeguarding the soul of a people. Far across the Caribbean waters, the Black Caribs, later known as the Garifuna, forged a parallel path of autonomy and cultural pride. Descendants of West African survivors of shipwrecks and the indigenous Kalinago people, the Black Caribs made their home on the island of St. Vincent. They lived as skilled seafarers and farmers, their society blending African and indigenous traditions into something entirely their own. Like the people of Palenque, they resisted European domination with remarkable tenacity. British colonial forces tried repeatedly to subdue them, But the Black Caribs defended their freedom through both diplomacy and force. Their villages, nestled between rugged mountains and rocky shores, became centers of a culture that celebrated ancestral connections through music, dance, and a language that carried the cadence of multiple worlds, even after their forced exile to Central America in the late 18th century. They carried their traditions with them, planting the seeds of what would become the modern Garifuna culture in Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, and beyond. The resilience of both Palenque and the Black Caribs mirrors the defiance of the Saramacca and Nduka in Suriname and echoes the courage of Nanis Maroons in Jamaica and Zambie's fighters in Brazil. These communities did more than survive, they thrived, each shaping a unique identity that wove African heritage into the fabric of the Americas. In every drumbeat, every whispered prayer, every child taught the language of their ancestors. They proved that freedom was not merely the absence of chains, but the active creation of a living, breathing culture. Their existence challenged the very foundations of colonial power, showing that no empire could fully extinguish the human drive for self-determination. Today, San Basilio de Palenque is recognized by UNESCO as a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity, a tribute to the enduring legacy of its people. Visitors hear the Palenquero language spoken in the streets and see festivals alive with music that has traveled across oceans and centuries. Likewise, the Garifuna descendants of the Black Caribs continue to celebrate their heritage with songs, dances, and rituals that blend African, indigenous, and Caribbean influences. Their culture has become an emblem of endurance and a living reminder of the power of memory and identity. In tracing their journeys, from the thick jungles of Colombia to the windswept coasts of St. Vincent and onward to the shores of Central America, we witness the same unbroken thread that ties all Maroon communities together. Whether in the rainforests of Suriname or the mountains of Jamaica, whether under the leadership of legendary figures like Nani or Zambi or in the quiet, collective strength of Palenque and the Black Caribs, the message remains the same. Freedom must be claimed and protected, and culture is the heartbeat that ensures it endures. The story of these communities is not a relic of the past, but a living testimony to the resilience of the human spirit. A reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, people can create a world that honors their ancestors and defines their own future. Centuries after the first fugitives carved their secret paths into mountain passes, dense rainforests, and hidden valleys, the descendants of those Maroon communities continue to walk the same ancestral lands, carrying forward a living heritage that refuses to fade. Their story is not one of the past alone but of an unbroken present, where the struggle for freedom has evolved into a vibrant affirmation of culture and identity. From the fortified hills of Jamaica to the quiet waterways of Suriname, from the cobbled streets of San Basilio de Palenque to the wind-brushed coasts, where the Garifuna people celebrate their roots. These descendants honor the courage of their forebears not by merely remembering them, but by inhabiting the very systems of self-rule and tradition that once defied colonial might. Their survival and their flourishing bring the narrative of Maroon resistance full circle, showing that the pursuit of liberty did not end with the signing of a treaty or the fall of an empire. It continues in the daily rhythm of community life. In villages tucked deep in Suriname's forest interior, the Saramacca and Nduka people still govern themselves according to customs first forged when their ancestors negotiated their hard-won treaties with the Dutch. Village councils meet beneath the towering trees to settle disputes and guide decisions, while elders recount the journeys of their ancestors who once slipped through the darkness of the jungle to freedom. Their rituals honor both the spirits of Africa and the living forest around them, blending ancient songs with the sound of drums that echo across the riverbanks. Annual festivals mark the anniversaries of those early treaties, transforming memories of hardship into celebrations of survival. These gatherings are not merely spectacles. They are acts of continuity, where each dance step and each melody reaffirms the independence their ancestors claimed. Far away in Jamaica, the descendants of Nanny's Maroons uphold their own traditions with equal devotion. In the Blue Mountains, where thick mists still curl like ghosts of the past, their festivals carry the pulse of African drums and the call and response of songs passed down for generations. These annual celebrations are both sacred and communal, binding the present to the past and reminding every participant that the freedom secured by their ancestors is a responsibility as well as a birthright. Their governance, still organized around councils and communal decision-making, reflects the principles of self-determination that Nanny and her followers defended with such fierce resolve. Across the Atlantic coast of Colombia, the people of San Basilio de Palenque continue to speak the Palenquero language, a living monument to their ancestors' will to remain distinct. Their annual cultural festivals fill the streets with music and dance, bright with the colors of African heritage and the joy of a community that has never forgotten its roots. Visitors hear not only the beat of drums, but the heartbeat of a people who turned their history of escape into a lasting celebration of identity. Likewise, the Garifuna communities, descended from the Black Caribs, mark their own festivals across Central America with music, spiritual rituals, and communal feasts that honor both their African and indigenous heritage. These events are moments when history is not confined to books or monuments. It is danced and tasted, alive in every drumbeat and every shared meal. Even in Brazil, the descendants of those who once lived in the mighty Quilombo dos Palmares continue to honor Zumbi's legacy. They gather to commemorate the hero who led their ancestors in defiance of Portuguese power, and to celebrate the unique culture that emerged from that defiance. Their voices carry stories of endurance and of the vision of a society where freedom was both a right and a daily practice. Through these celebrations, the memory of Palmares does not rest in silence. It resonates with the strength of a people who remember that freedom is never given but made. These communities, separated by oceans and centuries, are united by more than history. They share a common understanding that freedom is not a single event but a living process, renewed with every generation. Their governance systems, rooted in the wisdom of elders and the collective voice of the people, continue to embody the principles of autonomy their ancestors fought to secure. Their cultural practices, from language and music to food and ritual, remain the living proof that no empire, however powerful, could erase the heritage of those who once fled bondage. Each festival and each act of remembrance is both a tribute and a declaration. The spirit of Maroon resistance still thrives. The story that began with the desperate flight from plantations and the bold creation of hidden settlements has not ended. It continues in the voices of children learning the languages their ancestors preserved, in the songs that rise during annual celebrations, and in the councils that still guide their communities. It continues every time a drumbeat echoes across a river or a mountain path, reminding all who listen that the quest for freedom does not belong to the past. The descendants of Maroon communities stand today as living bridges between history and the present, embodying the truth that liberty, once claimed, must be cherished and renewed. Their lands, their festivals, and their enduring governance are not only memorials to what was one, but promises of what will always endure. Long after the first Maroon warriors carved out their hidden sanctuaries and secured treaties with colonial powers, the descendants of those defiant communities found themselves facing a new kind of challenge, ensuring that the hard-won freedom of their ancestors was recognized not only by tradition, but also by the modern nations that grew up around them. For centuries their self-governing societies survived on their own terms, guarding the forests, mountains, and rivers that once sheltered fugitives from enslavement. Yet as the 20th century unfolded, the pressure of expanding states, economic development, and shifting political borders threatened the very lands that had been sanctuaries for generations. It was in this landscape of changing times that modern laws began to rise, carrying echoes of the ancient agreements once signed in secrecy or sealed in the smoke of a peace fire. Brazil's 1988 constitution and the landmark 2007 Saramacca ruling stand as powerful affirmations that the legacy of the Maroons is not confined to history but continues to shape the present. In Brazil, the descendants of the famed quilombos, those fortified settlements like Palmares that once defied Portuguese colonial armies, had long preserved their communities with little acknowledgement from the state. For generations, families cultivated the same soil their ancestors defended, keeping alive the music, language, and rituals that Zumbi and his followers fought to protect. Yet the rapid growth of Brazil's cities and the hunger for land often pushed against the borders of these traditional territories. The 1988 Brazilian Constitution became a turning point. For the first time, it explicitly recognized the collective land rights of Quilombola communities, acknowledging not only their historical claim but also their continuing role as living stewards of the land. The Constitution's promise did more than grant legal titles. It honored the unbroken chain of resistance that stretched from the days when Maroons fought with bow and spear to the modern era when their descendants carried the memory of freedom in their songs and festivals. Thousands of miles to the north, in the dense forests of Suriname, the Saramacca people faced a struggle of their own. Their ancestors had secured treaties with the Dutch in the 18th century. Treaties that granted them autonomy and recognized their right to the forested lands they had defended with such determination. But centuries later, those forests became targets for logging and development, and the Saramacca found their way of life once again threatened. Their response was not to retreat into silence, but to carry their cause to the global stage. In 2007, after years of advocacy and legal battles, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued a historic ruling in their favor. The court recognized the Saramacca's collective land rights and affirmed that any development affecting their territory required their consent. It was a judgment that echoed the courage of their ancestors and placed their ancient struggle for freedom squarely within the language of modern international law. These legal milestones did not appear from nowhere. They were the result of generations of Maroon descendants who refused to let their heritage be erased, who maintained councils, languages, and festivals as living proof of their sovereignty. In Suriname, village elders still preside over ceremonies where the past is not merely remembered but embodied. Children learn the songs and dances that tell of their ancestors' escape into the forest and their defiance of colonial masters. In Brazil, the vibrant culture of the Quilombolas thrives in music, food, and art, each expression a testament to the freedom Zumbi envisioned when he led the people of Palmares. Their annual celebrations are more than festivals. They are declarations that the rights recognized in courtrooms and constitutions have roots far deeper than any legal text. The recognition of Maroon land rights in modern law brings the story of resistance into a new chapter. Where once freedom had to be seized in the night with stealth and bravery, now it is defended in courts and parliaments. Yet the essence remains unchanged, a determination to live according to their own customs, to protect the lands that nourished their ancestors, and to ensure that their children inherit not only territory but identity. The legal victories of 1988 and 2007 are symbols of a broader truth that the struggle for autonomy never ended with the fall of colonial empires, but continues in every generation that claims the right to live free. From the mountains of Jamaica where Nani's descendants still gather to honor her memory, to the Colombian lowlands where the Palenqueros speak their unique Creole tongue, to the Garifuna communities along the Central American coast whose music carries the voices of Africa and the Caribbean. The Maroon legacy is alive and strong. The constitutions and court rulings of today are not replacements for that legacy. They are acknowledgments of its enduring power. They affirm that the courage of those who once fled the plantations and built their own societies has not been forgotten, and that their descendants stand as rightful guardians of the lands and traditions that freedom made possible. As the 21st century unfolds, the Maroon story continues, not as a relic of the past but as a living example of resilience. The laws that now protect their autonomy give formal recognition to what their ancestors already knew, that freedom is a birthright earned by struggle and preserved through community. Each time the Saramacca hold their treaty festivals, or the Brazilian quilombolas celebrate their constitutional rights, they weave the ancient and the modern into a single, unbroken narrative. It is the story of a people who refuse to vanish and whose defiance, once whispered in the forests and sung in the night, now echoes in the halls of law and the hearts of those who still call these ancestral lands home. The story of the Maroons is not simply a footnote in the long and painful history of slavery. It is a powerful counter-narrative that turns the common image of passive suffering on its head. From the mountains of Jamaica to the forests of Suriname, from the mighty quilombos of Brazil to the hidden town of San Basilio de Palenque, the Maroons proved that human dignity can never be fully chained. They remind us that the enslaved were never merely victims of circumstance, but actors in their own history, strategists, builders, and visionaries who shaped a different world in defiance of empire. Their actions were not small acts of survival, but the deliberate creation of free black nations that would echo far beyond their own lifetimes. These communities, founded by those who risked everything to escape bondage, became living proof of African agency and resilience. They constructed their own systems of governance and law, balancing the ancestral wisdom carried across the Atlantic with the demands of the new lands they inhabited. They cultivated crops, defended their borders, and raised generations who would inherit not only freedom but also a vibrant cultural identity. Their songs and languages, their rituals and festivals, were more than expressions of joy. They were declarations of sovereignty, carrying the heartbeat of Africa into the Americas. To walk through the streets of Palenque, or to hear the drums of the Garifuna, is to feel the living presence of a people who refused to be forgotten. The courage of these Maroon societies inspired movements that would follow centuries later. Long before the great abolition campaigns of the 19th century, or the civil rights movements of the 20th, the Maroons demonstrated that liberation was possible, even against seemingly invincible powers. Their treaties, their victories in guerrilla warfare, and their ability to force colonial authorities to recognize their autonomy laid the groundwork for later struggles for independence and racial justice. Leaders of modern liberation movements, from anti-colonial activists in Africa and the Caribbean to champions of civil rights in the Americas, found in the Maroons a model of determination and self-rule. Their example helped to ignite the belief that oppressed people everywhere could chart their own destiny. Their legacy remains alive today. Descendants of Maroon communities continue to hold festivals that honor the treaties and victories of their ancestors. They still speak the languages their forebears preserved and keep alive the traditions that link them to the African continent and to one another. Modern legal victories, like Brazil's 1988 constitutional recognition of Quilombola lands and the 2007 Saramacca ruling in Suriname, show that the fight for autonomy continues in courts and communities alike. Each of these moments, each drumbeat, each legal recognition, each festival confirms that the spirit of Maroon resistance still burns brightly. As we reflect on this journey across centuries and continents, let us carry forward the lesson that freedom is never given, it is claimed, protected, and passed on. The Maroons teach us that courage and community can transform even the darkest oppression into a future filled with possibility. Their story invites us to honor the past not as distant history, but as a living guide for all who seek justice and dignity today. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of Maroon history and the remarkable resilience of these communities. If you found their story inspiring, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so that more people can learn about this powerful chapter of human endurance and hope. Your support helps keep these histories alive and encourages us to bring you more stories of courage and triumph. Have a peaceful evening. And to everyone watching, sleep well and dream of the unbreakable spirit that continues to shape our world. Good night.